Picture a single empire stretching from the Indus River in the east to the Aegean Sea in the west, from the scorching sands of Egypt to the icy passes of the Caucasus, governing somewhere between 40 and 50 million people at a time when the entire population of the planet was perhaps 200 million. No empire before it had ever come close to that scale. This was not Rome. It was not Greece. It came centuries before either of them reached anything like that size, and it built the administrative, logistical, and legal scaffolding that later empires would borrow, copy, and claim as their own innovations. We are talking about the Achaemenid Persian Empire, a civilization so vast and so advanced that the very idea of a multicultural, multilingual superstate, governed by a single coherent law code, first became a reality under its kings. And yet, if you ask most people today what they know about ancient Persia, you will likely hear about 300 Spartans, a vast horde of faceless soldiers, a tyrant on a golden throne, and a story of decadent Eastern despotism crushed by the heroic logic of the West. That story is almost entirely a Greek invention, repeated for 25 centuries, because the Greeks happened to be the ones who wrote it down and the ones whose language and culture the West chose to inherit. The real Persia was something else entirely. It was an empire that freed enslaved peoples instead of enslaving new ones. It was an empire that allowed Babylonians to worship Marduk, Egyptians to worship Osiris, and Jews to rebuild their temple in Jerusalem, all while paying taxes to a Persian king who called himself King of Kings. It was an empire that built roads so efficient a courier could cross 1,500 miles in a week, in a world where the fastest message anywhere else on Earth traveled at the speed of a walking man. It invented the postal relay system. It pioneered a unified currency and a standardized system of weights across 3 continents. It tolerated religious diversity not as a grudging concession, but as a deliberate policy of governance, codified and enforced by royal decree. By the time you finish this journey, you will understand why historians increasingly argue that the Achaemenid Empire deserves to be remembered not as the failed antagonist of a Greek morality play, but as one of the most sophisticated political experiments in human history, an empire whose fingerprints are still visible on the modern world, in our postal systems, our concepts of religious tolerance, our administrative law, and even the architecture of buildings we walk past every single day. So where did it all begin? To understand Persia, you first have to understand a piece of geography that almost no one ever thinks about: the Iranian Plateau. The Iranian Plateau is one of the most underrated landmasses on Earth. It sits like a raised stone shield between 2 of the cradles of civilization, Mesopotamia to the west and the Indus Valley to the east, and it is enormous, larger than the combined area of France, Germany, and Spain. But unlike the fertile river valleys on either side of it, the plateau is mostly arid, ringed by mountain ranges that trap moisture and starve the interior of rain. The Zagros Mountains rise along its western edge like a stone wall, forcing travelers and armies alike through a handful of narrow passes. The Elburz Range cuts across the north, separating the plateau from the lush, humid coastline of the Caspian Sea. To the east, the Hindu Kush and a brutal stretch of salt deserts, the Dasht-e-Kavir and the Dasht-e-Lut, make crossing the land nearly suicidal without local knowledge of where the hidden water sources lie. This geography did something fascinating to the people who lived there. It forced them to become masters of water management long before they became masters of conquest. The Qanat, an underground channel that taps into groundwater at the base of a mountain and carries it by gravity for miles to irrigate fields and supply towns without losing water to evaporation in the desert heat, may have been developed on this plateau as early as the start of the first millennium before the Common Era. Some still function today, after nearly 3,000 years, a testament to engineering so elegant that modern hydrologists still study them. This was the land that would eventually produce the most powerful empire the ancient world had ever known. But for thousands of years before that, it was simply a patchwork of independent peoples, kingdoms, and city-states, each adapting in their own way to a harsh and unforgiving landscape. Long before anyone called this region Persia, it was home to one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, a kingdom called Elam, centered in the southwestern lowlands near the Persian Gulf. in a region that is now part of modern Iran's Khuzestan province. Elam's history stretches back an almost unbelievable distance, with archaeological evidence of complex urban settlements dating to around 3200 BCE, making it roughly contemporary with early Sumer. The Elamites developed their own writing system, first a pictographic script and later a form of cuneiform, borrowed and adapted from their Mesopotamian neighbors, and they built a capital city called Susa that would remain important for thousands of years, eventually becoming one of the great administrative capitals of the Persian Empire itself. Elam fought wars with Sumerian and Akkadian city-states, was conquered and reconquered multiple times, and at its peak, under rulers in the 2nd millennium BCE, controlled territory that rivaled the great Mesopotamian powers of the era. The Elamites worshipped their own pantheon of gods, developed sophisticated metalworking, and left behind some of the most strikingly beautiful art of the ancient Near East, including the famous bronze statue of Napira-Su, a queen depicted with such anatomical precision and weight, over a ton of solid bronze and copper, that modern metallurgists still marvel at how Bronze Age craftsmen achieved the casting. Elam matters enormously to the Persian story because the later Achaemenid kings did not erase this civilization when they rose to power. They absorbed it. Susa became one of their primary capitals. Elamite remained one of the 3 official languages of imperial administration for centuries. The people who would later be called Persians built their empire on top of Elamite foundations, both literally and culturally, which is the first hint of a pattern that would define their entire civilization. A genius for absorbing, rather than annihilating, what came before. But the Elamites were not Persians and not Indo-European speakers at all. Their language appears to be unrelated to almost anything else on Earth, a linguistic isolate that has puzzled scholars for over a century. The actual ancestors of the Persians arrived on the Iranian plateau through one of history's great slow-motion migrations. Starting sometime in the 2nd millennium BCE, possibly as early as 2000 BCE, and continuing for centuries afterward, groups of Indo-Iranian-speaking peoples began moving south and east from the steppes of Central Asia, the same vast grassland sea that produced waves of migration into India, into Europe, and across much of Eurasia. These migrations were not a single dramatic invasion, but a long, gradual process, probably involving herders moving with their cattle and horses in search of new pasture, intermarrying with, and sometimes displacing the existing populations, and slowly imposing their language and customs across the plateau. Linguists can trace this migration with remarkable precision, because Old Persian, Avestan, and Sanskrit, the ancient language of India, all share a common ancestor, and by comparing shared vocabulary, especially words connected to chariots, horses, and specific religious concepts, researchers have reconstructed a probable homeland somewhere in the Eurasian steppe and a rough timeline for when these related peoples split apart and went their separate ways, one branch heading toward India, another settling onto the Iranian plateau. By around 1000 BCE, 2 major groups of these Iranian-speaking peoples had become dominant on the plateau: the Medes, who settled in the northwest, and the Persians, who settled further south and east, eventually concentrating in a region called Parsa, which is where the very name Persia ultimately comes from. The Medes arrived on the historical stage first, and for a long time, they were the senior partner in this relationship. Median territory centered around the city of Ecbatana, modern-day Hamadan, and by the 7th century BCE, the Medes had organized themselves into a kingdom powerful enough to challenge the great empires of Mesopotamia. Here is where the story gets genuinely dramatic, because the Medes were instrumental in one of the most consequential military events in ancient history, the destruction of the Assyrian Empire. Assyria had dominated the Near East for centuries through a combination of military terror and administrative brilliance, but by the late 7th century BCE, its grip was weakening. In 612 BCE, a coalition of Medes under their king Cyaxares and Babylonians under Nabopolassar besieged and destroyed Nineveh, the magnificent Assyrian capital, an event so significant that the prophet Nahum in the Hebrew Bible practically dances on Assyria's grave, describing the city's downfall. With Assyria gone, the Medes emerged as the dominant power across a huge swath of territory stretching from central Anatolia to the edges of the Iranian plateau. The Persians at this point were essentially a subject people, a collection of tribes paying tribute and allegiance to Median overlords. We know from later sources that Persian society was organized into multiple tribes, with the Pasargadae tribe holding a position of particular prestige, and within the Pasargadae, one specific clan would eventually produce a ruling dynasty, the Achaemenids, named after a semi-legendary ancestor called Achaemenes. For generations, this clan ruled the Persian tribes as vassals of the Median king, a regional dynasty of modest importance in a world dominated by larger powers, completely unaware that one of their own descendants was about to rewrite the rules of empire itself. That descendant's name was Cyrus, and to understand how staggering his rise actually was, you need to appreciate just how unlikely it seemed at the outset. Cyrus II, who history would come to call Cyrus the Great, was born sometime around 600 BCE, the exact date lost to history and tangled up with legend almost immediately. Greek historian Herodotus, writing roughly a century and a half after Cyrus's death, recorded a dramatic and almost certainly fictionalized account of his birth and childhood, claiming that Cyrus's grandfather, the Median king Astyages, dreamed that his infant grandson would grow up to overthrow him, and ordered the child killed. According to this story, the man tasked with the killing couldn't bring himself to do it, and instead gave the baby to a shepherd to raise in secret, and Cyrus grew up as a shepherd's son before his true identity was discovered, and the prophecy began working itself out anyway. This story follows an almost identical template to other ancient hero myths: abandoned royal children raised by humble families who rise to fulfill their destiny, a pattern that should immediately make any careful historian suspicious. We see versions of this same narrative structure applied to Moses, to Romulus and Remus, to countless legendary founders across different cultures, which strongly suggests that what we are dealing with is myth-making, rather than reportage. What we can say with more confidence, based on Babylonian records and other contemporary or near-contemporary sources, is that Cyrus inherited the throne of Persia around 559 BCE as a vassal king under Median authority, ruling from the region of Parsa, and that within roughly 2 decades, he would transform from a minor tributary ruler into the master of the largest empire the world had yet seen. The actual mechanics of how he did this, stripped of the fairy tale elements, is one of the most remarkable political and military stories in human history. The first domino to fall was Cyrus's own overlord, the Median king Astyages. Sometime around 553 to 550 BCE, Cyrus rebelled against Median authority. The details are frustratingly thin, but multiple ancient sources agree on the broad outline. There was a war, and at a critical moment, a significant portion of the Median army, including possibly its commanding general, defected to Cyrus's side. Whether this was due to genuine disaffection with Astyages' rule, clever diplomacy and bribery on Cyrus's part, or some combination of both, we cannot say for certain, but the effect was decisive. Astyages was captured, and the Median Empire, which had stood as one of the great powers of the Near East for the better part of a century, simply transferred its allegiance and its considerable territory to Cyrus almost overnight. This is a crucial point that gets lost in popular retellings. Cyrus did not destroy the Medes. He absorbed them, much as the future Persian Empire would absorb Elam. Median nobles continued to hold high positions in the new Persian state. Median administrative practices, which themselves had been refined over generations of governing a diverse Iranian and Mesopotamian population, were retained and built upon. The language used in official contexts sometimes treated Medes and Persians almost interchangeably, leading Greek writers to occasionally confuse the two peoples entirely. In a single stroke, Cyrus had roughly doubled his territory and inherited an entire administrative apparatus, and he had done it through a method that would become something of a signature: conquest through a combination of military pressure and the deliberate, strategic absorption of existing structures rather than their wholesale destruction. News of Cyrus's stunning victory over the Medes rippled across the ancient Near East and immediately alarmed the other major powers, none more than Croesus, the fabulously wealthy king of Lydia in western Anatolia, a kingdom so associated with riches that the phrase "rich" as Croesus has survived for 2,500 years as a description of extreme wealth. Croesus controlled territory along the Aegean coast, including Greek cities that paid him tribute, and he commanded resources from the gold-bearing rivers of his kingdom that made Lydian currency, some of the earliest coinage in the ancient world, famous across the Mediterranean. Seeing Cyrus's rapid expansion as a direct threat, and reportedly encouraged by an ambiguous oracle from Delphi that he interpreted, fatally, as favorable to himself, Croesus decided to strike first, crossing into formerly Median territory, around 547 or 546 BCE. The campaign that followed has been wrapped in legend, but the core military events seem reasonably well attested. After an initial inconclusive battle, Croesus withdrew his forces for the winter, assuming, as was conventional at the time, that Cyrus would also stand down until the spring campaign season. Cyrus did not. He pursued Croesus directly to the Lydian capital of Sardis, catching his enemy off guard. According to Herodotus, the decisive battle outside Sardis turned on an extraordinary piece of psychological warfare. Cyrus, knowing that horses are naturally frightened by the smell of camels, supposedly placed his baggage camels at the front of his lines, and the Lydian cavalry, renowned as some of the finest in the region, found their horses bolting in terror before the battle had even properly begun. Whether or not this specific detail is accurate, Sardis fell after a siege, Croesus was captured, and Lydia, with all its wealth and its access to the Aegean trade networks, became part of the expanding Persian state. The conquest of Lydia gave Cyrus something enormously valuable beyond gold: a foothold on the edge of the Greek world, bringing the Persian Empire into direct contact with Greek city-states for the first time, a relationship that would shape the next 2 centuries of history for both civilizations. With Media and Lydia absorbed, Cyrus turned his attention toward the greatest prize in the ancient Near East, Babylon. By the mid-6th century BCE, Babylon was perhaps the largest and wealthiest city on earth, ruled by King Nabonidus, a peculiar and controversial figure who had alienated much of his own population through what many Babylonians saw as religious eccentricity, particularly his apparent favoritism toward the moon god Sin at the expense of Marduk, the chief deity of the Babylonian pantheon, and the god whose priesthood held enormous political and economic power within the city. Nabonidus had also spent years away from the capital, residing in the Arabian desert oasis of Tema for reasons that remain debated among historians, leaving the day-to-day administration of Babylon to his son Belshazzar, the same figure who appears in the biblical book of Daniel at the famous feast where mysterious handwriting appears on the wall. When Cyrus marched on Babylonian territory in 539 BCE, he found a population and a priesthood that, according to multiple ancient sources including Babylonian records themselves, were remarkably unwilling to defend Nabonidus's regime. The Nabonidus Chronicle, a Babylonian cuneiform text, describes a battle at Opis where Cyrus's forces defeated the Babylonian army, followed by Cyrus's general capturing the city of Sippar, and then, most strikingly, the text describes Babylon itself falling without a battle, the gates simply opened. Whether this reflects genuine welcome, calculated capitulation by elites who saw resistance as futile, or some negotiated arrangement we don't fully understand, the practical result was that Cyrus entered the most powerful city in the world, almost without bloodshed, and he immediately moved to legitimize his rule, not as a foreign conqueror, but as a restorer of proper order. A king chosen by Marduk himself to remove the impious Nabonidus. This brings us to one of the most famous and most misunderstood artifacts in ancient history, the Cyrus cylinder. Discovered in 1879 during excavations in Babylon and now housed in the British Museum, this clay cylinder inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform records, in Cyrus's own voice, or at least the voice of his court scribes, his version of events following the conquest. The text describes Cyrus as the legitimate choice of Marduk, condemns Nabonidus for his religious failures, and crucially, describes Cyrus restoring images of various gods to their home temples and allowing peoples who had been displaced to return to their own lands. This document has been celebrated, sometimes with considerable exaggeration, as the world's first declaration of human rights, a characterization that modern scholars generally consider an overreach. since the cylinder is fundamentally a piece of royal propaganda in the established Mesopotamian tradition, following conventions used by Babylonian and Assyrian kings for centuries before Cyrus. But strip away the hyperbole, and there remains something genuinely remarkable. This was not an isolated boast. The biblical book of Ezra describes Cyrus issuing a decree allowing the Jewish people who had been exiled in Babylon since Nebuchadnezzar's conquest decades earlier to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, with the Persian state even providing for the return of temple treasures that had been confiscated. We have, in other words, multiple independent lines of evidence, a Babylonian cylinder, and a Hebrew religious text written from a completely different cultural perspective, both describing the same general policy. Cyrus did not simply conquer peoples, he often released them, restored their religious institutions, and allowed deported populations to return home. This was not universal or perfectly consistent practice across his entire reign, and historians rightly caution against turning Cyrus into a flawless humanitarian by modern standards. But compared to the standard practices of Near Eastern conquest up to that point, mass deportation, destruction of religious sites, the imposition of foreign gods, this represented a genuinely different approach to empire, one rooted in the practical recognition that a contented, religiously undisturbed population was easier and cheaper to govern than a resentful, forcibly converted one. Cyrus's reputation for relatively enlightened rule was not simply a later Romantic invention either. It is worth noting that even Greek writers, who would later construct such an unflattering picture of Persian kingship in general, treated Cyrus himself as something of an exception, an almost idealized model of wise and capable leadership. The Greek historian and soldier Xenophon, writing more than a century after Cyrus's death, composed an entire work, the Cyropaedia, presenting Cyrus as a kind of philosophical ideal of just kingship, a text that would go on to influence Western political thought for centuries afterward, reportedly admired by figures as varied as the Roman statesman Cicero and, much later, the founding generation of the United States, with Thomas Jefferson himself known to have owned and read multiple copies of Xenophon's account. This is a genuinely remarkable detail once you sit with it. The same Greek intellectual tradition that demonized later Persian kings as decadent tyrants nonetheless preserved and celebrated the founder of that very dynasty as a model worth emulating, suggesting that the wholesale vilification of Persia in Western memory was never quite as total or as consistent as the popular caricature implies, and that even within hostile sources, the genuine scale of Cyrus's achievement and the apparent wisdom of his governing philosophy managed to shine through the cultural bias surrounding it. Parts of Central Asia and the territory of various other peoples to his empire before meeting his end in 530 BCE during a military campaign against the Massagetae, a nomadic people somewhere in the region east of the Caspian Sea, possibly in what is now Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan. Herodotus tells a dramatic, almost certainly embellished story involving the Massagetae queen Tomyris, Cyrus's death in battle, and Tomyris allegedly having his severed head placed in a wineskin filled with blood as gruesome revenge for the death of her son. But as with so much of Cyrus's biography, we are dealing with legend, layered over a thin substrate of fact. What we know with more confidence is that Cyrus died on campaign, that his body was returned for burial, and that his tomb, a relatively modest gabled stone structure at Pasargadae, the city he had built as his capital, still stands today, one of the very few Achaemenid royal monuments to survive, largely intact into the modern era. The tomb's simplicity is itself revealing. There is no enormous pyramid, no overwhelming display of imperial wealth, just clean limestone construction on a stepped platform, an enduring symbol of a ruler whose actual legacy rested less on monumental ego and more on the durability of the institutions he created. By the time of his death, Cyrus had built an empire stretching from the Aegean Sea to Central Asia, larger than any state that had previously existed, and he had done it within a single lifetime. Roughly 30 years from inheriting a minor vassal kingdom to ruling an empire of unprecedented scale. The question that now mattered was whether anyone could hold it together. This is where Cyrus's genius as an administrator, as opposed to simply a conqueror, becomes critical to the story. because conquering territory and governing it are entirely different challenges, and many ambitious empire builders throughout history have excelled at the former, while catastrophically failing at the latter. Cyrus and his successors developed a system of provincial governance built around the satrapy, a Persian term referring to a province governed by an official called a satrap, essentially a regional governor who wielded substantial autonomous authority while remaining ultimately accountable to the King of Kings. This system would be expanded and formalized considerably under later rulers, particularly Darius, but its foundations were laid under Cyrus, who recognized something that many ancient conquerors did not: that an empire spanning multiple continents, dozens of languages, and wildly different cultural and religious traditions could not be governed through micromanagement from a single center. Instead, satraps were typically given considerable latitude to administer their territories according to local custom, provided they maintained order, supplied military levies when called upon, and most importantly, delivered the required tribute to the royal treasury. This was not the same as full independence. Satraps were subject to inspection by royal officials who traveled the empire as the eyes and ears of the king. A system of oversight designed specifically to prevent regional governors from becoming powerful enough to challenge the throne, and the existence of a standing royal army loyal directly to the king, rather than to any regional power base, served as a further check on potential rebellion. The result was a hybrid system, centralized enough to maintain coherent imperial policy and extract reliable revenue, decentralized enough to allow Egyptians to remain culturally Egyptian, Babylonians to remain culturally Babylonian, and Lydians to remain culturally Lydian, all while paying taxes to the same distant king. When Cyrus died in 530 BCE, the throne passed to his son Cambyses II, a king whose historical reputation has suffered enormously from the fact that the most detailed surviving account of his reign comes from Herodotus. Writing for a Greek audience that had every cultural incentive to portray Persian kings as increasingly unstable tyrants, the further the narrative moved from the heroic founder Cyrus. Herodotus describes Cambyses as prone to madness, supposedly killing the sacred Egyptian Apis bull out of contempt for Egyptian religion, murdering his own brother Bardia in a fit of paranoid jealousy, and eventually dying from an accidental self-inflicted wound that some ancient observers interpreted as divine punishment for his sacrilege. Modern historians treat almost all of this with considerable skepticism. Egyptian sources from Cambyses' own reign, including inscriptions from Egyptian officials who served under him, actually describe him in respectful and even favorable terms, suggesting that the portrait of religious vandalism may be largely or entirely a later invention, possibly originating from Egyptian priests who had political reasons of their own to vilify the conqueror, reasons that then got absorbed uncritically into Greek historical tradition. What we can say with confidence is that Cambyses accomplished something his father never managed: the conquest of Egypt. In 525 BCE, Cambyses led a Persian army into Egypt and decisively defeated Pharaoh Psamtik III at the Battle of Pelusium, bringing the entire Nile Valley, with its immense agricultural wealth and its ancient, prestigious civilization, under Persian control. This made the Achaemenid Empire, for the first time, a power spanning 3 continents: Asia, Africa, and the edges of Europe through Anatolia and Lydia. An empire of a scale that simply had no precedent in recorded history up to that point. The succession crisis that followed Cambyses' death in 522 BCE is one of the murkiest and most consequential episodes in early Persian history, and untangling fact from later political spin is extraordinarily difficult, in large part because our primary source for the events is an inscription commissioned by the very man who emerged victorious from the chaos. That man was Darius. And the document is the Behistun inscription, an enormous trilingual relief carved into a cliff face in western Iran, written in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian cuneiform, describing Darius's version of how he came to the throne. According to this account, Cambyses' brother Bardia had been secretly murdered before Cambyses even departed for Egypt, but an impostor, a magus named Gaumata, who bore a striking physical resemblance to the dead prince, seized the throne by pretending to be Bardia while Cambyses was away, and presumably unable to expose the deception before his own death. Darius claims that he, along with 6 other Persian noblemen, uncovered this conspiracy and killed the false Bardia, after which Darius was elevated to the kingship. This is, to put it mildly, a story that should raise every historian's suspicion, because it conveniently casts Darius, who had no obviously strong hereditary claim to the throne himself, as the heroic restorer of legitimate rule, rather than as a usurper who eliminated a genuine rival and then invented a cover story to justify it. Many modern historians suspect that the real Bardia was never killed at all, and that Darius's elaborate tale of an impostor Magus was constructed after the fact specifically to legitimize what was, in plain terms, a coup. We may never know the full truth with certainty, but what followed Darius's seizure of power is not in doubt. A wave of rebellions erupted across the empire, in Babylon, in Elam, in Media, in Egypt, and across various Persian territories, as regional populations and rival claimants tested whether this new and uncertain king could actually hold the empire together. The Behistun inscription itself catalogues these revolts in detail, partly as a historical record and partly as a piece of triumphant propaganda, listing the various rebel leaders Darius defeated and the brutal punishments inflicted on them, intended as a warning to anyone else considering rebellion. Within roughly 2 years, Darius had crushed every uprising and secured his hold on the throne, an achievement that, regardless of the murky circumstances of his rise, demonstrated genuine military and political skill. It was Darius, ruling from 522 to 486 BCE, who took the somewhat improvised administrative arrangements inherited from Cyrus and transformed them into the truly sophisticated imperial bureaucracy that would define Achaemenid governance for the next century and a half. Darius formalized the satrapy system into a clearly defined structure of provinces, somewhere between 20 and 30 depending on the period and how you count subdivisions, each with an assigned tribute obligation calibrated to its economic capacity, a policy that itself represented a remarkable piece of administrative sophistication for the era, since it required systematic assessment of each region's wealth and productive capacity rather than simply demanding arbitrary tribute and hoping for compliance. Herodotus actually preserves a detailed list of the tribute owed by each satrapy, and while we should treat his specific figures with some caution, the overall picture of a carefully calculated, differentiated taxation system aligns well with what we know from Persian administrative archives discovered at Persepolis itself, particularly the Persepolis fortification tablets. Thousands of small clay tablets recording the day-to-day administration of food rations, travel permits, and resource allocation across the empire, written primarily in Elamite. These tablets, only fully excavated and translated over the course of the 20th century, give us an extraordinarily granular window into how the empire actually functioned on a bureaucratic level, far removed from the grand narratives of kings and battles, showing scribes tracking the movement of goods, the rationing of wine and grain to traveling officials, and the operation of what was clearly a highly literate, highly organized administrative class operating in multiple languages simultaneously. Darius also gets credit, with good supporting evidence, for one of the most impressive infrastructure projects of the ancient world, the Royal Road. This was not a single road, but a network of well-maintained routes connecting major cities of the empire, the most famous stretch running roughly 1,600 miles from Sardis in western Anatolia to Susa in the Persian heartland. Herodotus describes a courier relay system along this route, with way stations positioned at intervals roughly equivalent to a day's ride apart, stocked with fresh horses and supplies, allowing messages to be passed from one rider to the next in a continuous relay rather than requiring a single exhausted messenger to cover the entire distance. Herodotus claims this system, which the Greeks called the Angarion, could move a message across the full length of the road in roughly 7 to 9 days. An almost unbelievable speed for the ancient world, considering that an ordinary traveler making the same journey on foot or by ordinary means would require approximately 3 months. This achievement so impressed Herodotus that he wrote admiringly, in words that have echoed through history, that nothing mortal travels faster than these Persian couriers, a line that centuries later would inspire the motto adopted by the New York City Post Office: The Royal Road and its associated relay system represented something genuinely revolutionary, a state communications network operating at a speed and reliability that simply had no parallel anywhere else in the ancient world. Allowing a king sitting in Susa or Persepolis to receive intelligence and issue commands across a territory spanning thousands of miles with a responsiveness that would not be matched again until the development of the telegraph more than 2,000 years later. This communications infrastructure connected to an equally impressive economic system. Darius is credited with introducing a standardized gold coin, the daric, alongside silver coinage called the siglos, creating a more uniform monetary system that facilitated trade across the empire's enormously diverse territories, even though many regions continued to use their own local currencies and barter systems alongside the new royal coinage. Trade networks under Persian rule connected the Mediterranean world to Central Asia and, indirectly, to India, with the empire's control over key transit routes generating substantial wealth through tolls, tariffs, and the taxation of merchant activity. Agricultural production was similarly systematized, with irrigation projects, including the expansion of qanat systems and major canal works, particularly in Mesopotamia and around the Nile, supporting population growth and surplus production that could be taxed to fund the imperial court, the military, and the enormous building projects that Darius and his successors would undertake. Perhaps the single most consequential aspect of Persian administrative philosophy, and the area where Persia's reputation has been most thoroughly distorted by later Greek and Western sources, concerns religious policy. The Achaemenid kings, with rare and specific exceptions, usually tied to political rebellion rather than simple religious intolerance, did not attempt to impose Zoroastrianism, the faith most closely associated with the Persian royal house itself, on their subject populations. Egyptians continued worshipping their traditional gods, with Persian kings even appearing in some Egyptian inscriptions performing pharaonic religious duties in order to legitimize their rule in specifically Egyptian terms. Babylonian temples continued operating with royal Persian financial support in many cases. The Jewish community, as already discussed, was permitted and even assisted in rebuilding their temple in Jerusalem, and the biblical books of Ezra and Nehemiah describe subsequent Persian kings, including Artaxerxes I, continuing to support this project and granting Jewish officials like Nehemiah significant authority to govern Jerusalem as part of the Persian provincial system. This was not modern secular pluralism, and it would be a mistake to project contemporary values backward onto an ancient absolute monarchy. The Persian kings were not running a liberal democracy with freedom of conscience as an abstract philosophical principle. Rather, this approach reflected a hard-headed and remarkably effective practical philosophy of governance. A vast empire of conquered peoples is far easier and cheaper to control when those peoples are allowed to maintain their traditional religious and cultural practices. Their local elites retain meaningful authority, and the imperial center focuses its demands on tribute, military support, and basic political loyalty, rather than attempting the far more difficult and provocative task of cultural and religious homogenization. This pragmatic tolerance stands in sharp contrast to the popular image of Oriental despotism that later Western tradition would attach to Persia, an image born largely from Greek wartime propaganda that we will examine in considerable detail later in this story. No discussion of Darius's reign would be complete without addressing his most spectacular architectural legacy, Persepolis. Construction began around 518 BCE on a massive stone terrace in the Persian heartland, and the project would continue under Darius's successors for decades, ultimately producing one of the most architecturally sophisticated complexes in the ancient world. What makes Persepolis particularly fascinating from a historical perspective is that it was never primarily a city in the conventional sense, not a major population center for ordinary commerce and daily life, but rather a ceremonial and administrative capital, used especially for the celebration of the Persian New Year festival, Nowruz, when representatives and tribute bearers from across the empire would travel to present gifts to the king in an enormous, carefully choreographed display of imperial unity and submission. The famous reliefs carved into the staircases of the Apadana, the great audience hall, depict long processions of delegates from across the empire, each group identifiable by distinctive clothing, hairstyles, and the specific gifts they carry. Medes and Elamites, Babylonians and Egyptians, Indians and Scythians, Arabians and Ethiopians. An extraordinary visual catalog of the empire's staggering diversity carved in stone and intended to be seen by visiting dignitaries as a permanent demonstration of Persian power and the willing participation of subject peoples in the common Imperial order. The architectural style itself tells a story of cultural synthesis rather than pure Persian invention. The massive columns, some reaching nearly 20 meters in height, employed construction techniques and decorative motifs borrowed from Egyptian, Greek, Lydian, and Mesopotamian traditions, with ancient inscriptions at the site, explicitly crediting workers and materials from numerous different parts of the empire: cedar from Lebanon, gold from Sardis and Bactria, ivory from Ethiopia and India, and skilled craftsmen drawn from Ionia, Babylon, and Egypt. This was, quite deliberately, an empire literally building its capital out of the contributions of its constituent peoples, a physical, architectural statement of the diversity Darius and his successors wanted to project. Court life within this empire operated according to elaborate protocols that fascinated and sometimes alarmed Greek observers who tended to interpret Persian royal ceremony, including practices like prostration before the king, as evidence of slavish servility utterly incompatible with the free citizen ideals Greeks like to imagine defined their own city-states. In reality, what the Greeks were observing was simply a different cultural framework for expressing hierarchy and respect, no more inherently degrading than bowing to a monarch in medieval Europe or any number of court customs found across human history. But Greek writers, eager to construct a moral and political contrast between supposedly free Greeks and supposedly enslaved Persians, consistently framed these customs in the most negative possible light. The royal court itself was an enormous, mobile institution, since Persian kings did not reside permanently in any single capital but moved seasonally between Persepolis, Susa, Babylon, and Ecbatana, taking advantage of different climates throughout the year, Susa being favorable in winter and the mountain capital of Ecbatana offering relief from summer heat. This itinerant court included not just the king but his extended family, harem, household staff, administrative officials, and a substantial military escort, representing a massive logistical operation that itself demonstrates the underlying sophistication of Persian administrative capacity, since feeding, housing, and transporting thousands of people across hundreds of miles multiple times per year required exactly the kind of organizational competence that the Persepolis fortification tablets reveal in granular bureaucratic detail. The role of women in Achaemenid Persian society is a subject that has been substantially revised by modern scholarship, partly because Greek sources, our traditional primary window into Persian culture, were written by men from a society that itself restricted women's public roles considerably, and these writers often projected their own assumptions, or constructed deliberately exoticized and sometimes salacious portraits of the Persian royal harem, emphasizing intrigue, sexual scandal, and feminine manipulation behind the scenes of male political power. The archaeological and administrative record paints a more complex picture. Royal women, particularly the queen mother and principal royal wives, could possess substantial independent wealth, including land grants and estates that generated income they controlled directly, evidenced by administrative documents recording transactions and resource management connected to specific royal women. Atossa, daughter of Cyrus the Great and wife of Darius, appears in multiple sources as a figure of genuine political influence at court. And the very fact that royal succession in at least one documented instance seems to have been influenced by which wife held greater status suggests that royal women were active political players rather than passive background figures. Outside the royal family, the Persepolis fortification tablets reveal that women, including those identified as supervisors, could receive rations and wages comparable in some cases to men performing similar work. And women appear managing workshops and overseeing groups of laborers, indicating that economic participation by women extended beyond the absolute top tier of society into administrative and productive roles. Even if the most powerful political positions remained dominated by men, this does not mean Achaemenid Persia was an egalitarian society by modern standards. but it complicates the simplistic Orientalist image of Persian women as exclusively cloistered harem ornaments, a stereotype that says considerably more about later Western fantasy than about documented Achaemenid social reality. Life for ordinary people across this vast empire varied enormously depending on where exactly you happened to live, which is itself one of the most important things to understand about Achaemenid Persia. There was no single uniform Persian experience imposed across the territory, but rather a patchwork of regional continuities operating under a shared imperial superstructure. In Mesopotamia, the heartland of Babylonian civilization, daily life for most people continued along lines that would have been recognizable to their ancestors for over 1,000 years, farming barley and dates along the irrigated floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates, participating in temple economies where religious institutions functioned as major employers and lenders, and conducting business using cuneiform contracts that continued the legal traditions of Hammurabi's era, now simply incorporating Persian administrative oversight and taxation into an already ancient bureaucratic system. In Egypt, daily life similarly retained deep continuity with pharaonic tradition. The agricultural cycle dictated by the Nile's annual flood, traditional religious practices centered on temples to Amun, Osiris, and other gods continuing, largely uninterrupted, and Egyptian scribes maintaining their own administrative and legal traditions in hieratic and demotic script, even as Persian satraps oversaw the collection of tribute. In Anatolia, particularly in the Greek cities along the Ionian coast that had come under Persian control through the conquest of Lydia, life involved a more direct and sometimes uncomfortable cultural friction. Since these cities had previously enjoyed considerable autonomy as independent or quasi-independent city-states with their own democratic or oligarchic traditions and Persian rule, while generally allowing considerable local self-governance, did install or support local tyrants in some cities, specifically because such rulers proved more reliably cooperative with Persian interests than fully autonomous democratic assemblies, a policy that would directly contribute to the tensions eventually exploding into the Ionian Revolt. In Central Asia, in regions like Bactria and Sogdia, archaeological evidence suggests a more frontier-like character to Persian administration, with fortified settlements and a heavier military presence, reflecting the genuine challenges of governing territory bordering nomadic steppe populations who did not always recognize Persian authority. Along the Levantine coast, Phoenician cities like Tyre and Sidon retained their famous maritime trading networks and considerable commercial autonomy, with Phoenician fleets actually serving as a critical component of Persian naval power in later conflicts. Since the Persians themselves were not a particularly seafaring people and relied heavily on subject populations with established maritime traditions, primarily Phoenicians and Egyptians, to provide naval capability. This brings us to one of the genuinely surprising and underappreciated aspects of the Achaemenid Empire, its staggering linguistic diversity and the administrative sophistication required to manage it. Official royal inscriptions, like the Behistun inscription discussed earlier, were typically rendered in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, reflecting the layered administrative legacy the empire had absorbed. But the empire's actual day-to-day correspondence increasingly relied on Aramaic, a Semitic language that had already been spreading as a regional lingua franca across the Near East before the Persians arrived, and which the Achaemenid administration adopted and promoted as the practical working language for imperial bureaucracy across most of the Western Empire, a choice of remarkable pragmatism, since Aramaic was already widely understood across Mesopotamia, the Levant, and parts of Anatolia, making it a far more efficient choice for an administration trying to communicate across such vast and linguistically varied territory than attempting to impose Old Persian, the language of the ruling ethnic group, on everyone else. This decision, sometimes called Imperial Aramaic by modern scholars, meant that a Jewish official in Jerusalem, a Babylonian merchant, and a Persian satrap's clerk in Egypt could all potentially read and write the same administrative language, even while speaking entirely different languages at home. A linguistic infrastructure decision so practical and far-sighted that versions of Aramaic would continue serving as a major regional language for centuries after the Achaemenid Empire itself had fallen, eventually becoming, among other things, the everyday language spoken in first-century Judea, including, according to the New Testament, the language spoken by Jesus of Nazareth himself, a direct linguistic legacy traceable back to Achaemenid administrative policy. All of this regional and linguistic diversity raises an obvious question worth pausing on before we move further into the empire's political history. How did Persia actually pay for all of it? And what kept a system this sprawling economically viable across so many generations? Let's go deeper into how this empire actually paid for itself, because the financial machinery underlying Achaemenid power is genuinely one of the most impressive and least appreciated aspects of the entire civilization. Tribute, as already mentioned, was assessed differently across the various satrapies, calibrated according to each region's economic capacity. But the practical mechanics of collecting and transporting this wealth across thousands of miles required an administrative system of extraordinary sophistication. Herodotus describes specific tribute amounts owed by each satrapy, often paid partly in precious metal and partly in kind, with Egypt, for example, owing not just silver but also grain to help feed the empire's military garrisons stationed there, while horse-rich regions like Media and Cilicia contributed livestock alongside monetary tribute, and Indian satrapies reportedly sent gold dust collected from their territories. This tribute flowed toward royal treasuries maintained at multiple locations, Susa, Persepolis, Ecbatana, and Babylon among them, where it was stored, in part, as an almost static reserve of bullion rather than being continuously recirculated through the economy, a practice that some modern economic historians have criticized as potentially deflationary or economically inefficient by modern standards. Since enormous quantities of silver and gold sat essentially inert in royal vaults for generations rather than actively circulating, though it's worth remembering that ancient economies operated under entirely different assumptions about monetary policy than anything resembling modern economic theory, and the accumulation of visible, tangible royal wealth served important political and symbolic functions, demonstrating the king's power and his capacity to reward loyal service, fund military campaigns when necessary, and maintain the lavish court life that itself functioned as a kind of political theater, reinforcing royal authority across an empire where most subjects would never personally see the king, but would nonetheless hear about his wealth and majesty through traveling officials, merchants, and the simple, awe-inspiring scale of structures like Persepolis. Agricultural production formed the actual economic bedrock beneath all this tribute and trade, and the Achaemenid administration appears to have taken agricultural productivity seriously as a matter of deliberate state policy, rather than simply extracting whatever surplus happened to exist. The Qanat irrigation systems already mentioned allowed agricultural expansion into areas of the Iranian plateau that would otherwise have been unable to support significant farming, and Persian administrators actively encouraged the spread of useful crops and agricultural techniques across the empire's diverse territories, with some ancient sources crediting Persian rule with the deliberate transplantation of fruit trees, particularly varieties of date palm, citrus, and other crops, between regions where they had not previously grown, a kind of ancient agricultural exchange program facilitated by the empire's unified administrative structure and its remarkably efficient transportation and communication networks. In Mesopotamia, the maintenance and expansion of canal systems along the Tigris and Euphrates continued, and in some cases extended infrastructure projects that Babylonian rulers had pursued for centuries, while in Egypt, Persian administration generally worked within the existing pharaonic framework for managing the Nile's annual flood cycle rather than imposing fundamentally different agricultural practices. Again, illustrating the broader Achaemenid pattern of building upon rather than replacing established local systems wherever those systems already functioned effectively. The question of slavery and labor within the Achaemenid Empire deserves careful and honest treatment, because this is an area where popular assumptions, often shaped by comparison to later and better documented slave societies like Rome or the antebellum American South, can mislead more than they illuminate. Slavery did exist within the Persian Empire, as it did in virtually every ancient society, but the institution appears to have functioned somewhat differently than the chattel slavery systems most familiar to modern audiences. The Persepolis fortification tablets reveal a labor system involving large groups of workers, sometimes identified by terms that scholars have translated variously as workers, laborers, or in some cases more directly as something resembling slaves or bonded laborers, who received regular rations of food, specifically grain, wine, and other provisions, as compensation for their labor on royal construction projects and other state enterprises, a system that occupied an ambiguous space between what modern categories would call free wage labor and unfree bonded servitude. Since these workers, while compensated and apparently not bought and sold as commodities in the way chattel slaves were in other ancient and later societies, nonetheless appear to have had limited personal freedom regarding where they worked and under what conditions. Some of this labor force consisted of prisoners of war or populations deported following military campaigns and rebellions, continuing a practice with deep roots in earlier Mesopotamian and Assyrian imperial tradition. Even as Cyrus's specific policy of allowing certain deported populations, most famously the Jewish exiles, to return home, represents an important counterexample, demonstrating that deportation and resettlement were not universal or uniformly applied policies, but rather tools used selectively according to specific political circumstances and royal priorities. The massive construction projects at Persepolis and elsewhere relied heavily on this combination of compensated but constrained labor, skilled craftsmen drawn from across the empire who were apparently paid well and treated with considerable respect given the sophistication and clearly valued nature of their work, and less skilled laborers performing the enormous physical effort required to quarry, transport, and assemble the massive stone elements of these monumental structures, a labor hierarchy that, while certainly involving coercion and unfree status for some participants, does not map cleanly onto modern conceptions of slavery as a monolithic institution defined purely by the buying and selling of human beings as property. Beyond the laboring classes, Achaemenid society maintained a recognizable aristocratic hierarchy, with Persian and Median noble families occupying the most prestigious positions closest to the royal court, often holding hereditary claims to specific administrative or military offices, and frequently intermarrying with the royal family itself to cement political alliances and reinforce their elevated status. Below this narrow apex of Persian and Median nobility existed a much broader class of local elites across the empire's various conquered territories: Babylonian priestly families, Egyptian temple administrators, Phoenician merchant aristocrats, and Anatolian and Levantine local rulers who retained considerable wealth, social status, and practical authority within their own communities, even while operating under the ultimate authority of Persian satraps and the distant king, an arrangement that gave these local elites genuine incentive to cooperate with imperial administration rather than resist it, since their own continued privilege and authority depended substantially on maintaining good standing within the broader Persian imperial order, rather than on any genuine loyalty to Persian ethnic or cultural identity specifically. For the vast majority of ordinary subjects, farmers, artisans, small merchants, and laborers who made up the overwhelming bulk of the empire's population, daily life likely involved relatively limited direct contact with the apparatus of Persian imperial administration beyond the periodic collection of taxes and tribute and occasional conscription for military service or labor projects, with most people's lives continuing to be shaped primarily by local customs, local religious practices, and local economic and social structures that had existed long before Persian conquest and would, in many cases, persist long after Persian rule eventually ended. A reminder that even the most successful and sophisticated ancient empires governed through a relatively light administrative touch compared to the kind of deep, pervasive state presence that modern citizens experience in their own daily lives. Let's return for a moment to Cambyses and look more closely at the conquest of Egypt, because the campaign itself reveals fascinating details about how Persian military planning operated at this early stage of imperial expansion. Egypt presented a unique strategic challenge that none of the previous Persian conquests had quite matched, since reaching it required crossing the Sinai Peninsula, a genuinely hostile desert environment where water scarcity could destroy an invading army just as effectively as any human enemy. According to Herodotus, Cambyses solved this logistical problem through diplomacy with Arabian tribes who controlled the desert route, arranging for camels carrying water skins to accompany his army across the otherwise impassable terrain, a detail that, whatever its precise accuracy, reflects the genuine logistical sophistication required to project Persian military power across such varied and challenging geography. Once in Egypt, the decisive Battle of Pelusium saw Cambyses's forces, which included Greek mercenaries serving on the Persian side, a detail that complicates any simple narrative of Greeks versus Persians as monolithic opposing civilizations, defeat the Egyptian pharaoh Psamtik III, who was subsequently captured and, according to most accounts, treated initially with a degree of mercy before later being executed after apparently attempting to organize resistance against Persian rule, illustrating a pattern that would repeat throughout Achaemenid history. Conquered rulers who accepted their new subordinate status and cooperated with Persian administration were often treated with surprising leniency, while those who continued plotting rebellion faced harsh consequences. The figure of Atossa deserves more sustained attention than she typically receives, because her life intersects with an extraordinary span of early Achaemenid history in ways that illuminate how royal women actually functioned within the dynasty's political structure. As a daughter of Cyrus the Great, Atossa would have grown up amid the founding of the empire itself, and her subsequent marriages, first reportedly to her own brother Cambyses II following a Persian royal practice of close kin marriage intended to consolidate the bloodline's claim to legitimacy, and later to Darius after Cambyses's death, and the chaotic succession crisis that followed, positioned her at the center of Achaemenid dynastic politics across multiple reigns. Her marriage to Darius proved particularly consequential because it helped cement his legitimacy as Cyrus's successor, despite Darius coming from a different branch of the extended Achaemenid family, and her son with Darius, who would become Xerxes I, benefited directly from this connection to Cyrus's bloodline through his mother when questions of succession arose among Darius's various sons from different wives, with several ancient sources suggesting that Atossa's status and influence played a meaningful role in Xerxes ultimately being chosen as heir over his half-brothers, some of whom may have had stronger claims based purely on birth order. This pattern, royal women serving as crucial links legitimizing dynastic continuity and actively influencing succession outcomes, appears repeatedly throughout Achaemenid history and represents a genuine corrective to the simplified Orientalist image of passive harem women existing purely as decorative status symbols for male rulers. Artemisia of Halicarnassus represents another figure whose documented role complicates simplistic narratives about both Persian governance and Greek attitudes toward women in positions of authority. As ruler of her own city-state in Anatolia, she had inherited her position following the death of her husband and ruled as a tributary monarch within the Persian imperial system, commanding her own military forces, including ships that she personally led during Xerxes' invasion of Greece, making her one of the relatively few women in the ancient Mediterranean world known to have held direct independent military command. Herodotus's evident admiration for her tactical judgment. He describes her as offering Xerxes the wisest counsel among all his advisors before the Battle of Salamis, advice the king ultimately chose not to follow, stands out precisely because it cuts against the general pattern of Greek sources treating Persian decision-making as inherently flawed or despotic, suggesting that even within a fundamentally biased historiographical tradition, individual figures of genuine skill and judgment could earn recognition that transcended the broader cultural stereotypes being constructed around them. Beyond Artemisia, the Achaemenid system regularly relied on capable client rulers and local elites of this kind across its territories, demonstrating that the empire's administrative flexibility extended to accommodating female rulers in specific local contexts, even though supreme royal authority itself remained exclusively male throughout the dynasties. History. Among Persian nobles and military commanders, figures like Mardonius, who led the punitive expedition into Thrace and Macedon, and later commanded the land forces left in Greece after Xerxes' withdrawal following Salamis, illustrate the close intertwining of royal family and military leadership that characterized Achaemenid governance. Since Mardonius was Darius's son-in-law and had married into the royal family, a typical pattern where the highest military commands were entrusted to men bound to the royal house through blood or marriage, ensuring a degree of loyalty that purely meritocratic appointment might not have guaranteed, even if this system occasionally elevated commanders whose family connections exceeded their tactical skill. Other administrators whose names survive in the historical record, like Tattenai, the Persian governor of the province beyond the river mentioned in the biblical book of Ezra, overseeing affairs in the Levant, including the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple, demonstrate the empire's reliance on a professional administrative class operating at the provincial level, men who, whether ethnically Persian or drawn from other peoples within the empire, carried out the actual day-to-day work of governance, tax collection, and dispute resolution that allowed the grand imperial structure to function effectively across such enormous distances from the royal court. A class of competent mid-level officials whose individual names mostly disappear from history, but whose collective administrative labor represents the true, often invisible backbone of Achaemenid imperial success. The tensions simmering in Ionia finally boiled over in 499 BCE, igniting a conflict that would shape how the Western world remembers Persia for the next 2,500 years. The spark came from an unlikely source, a local tyrant named Histiaeus and his ambitious relative Aristagoras, who ruled the city of Miletus under Persian authority. Aristagoras had gotten himself into political trouble after a failed military expedition against the island of Naxos that he had promised Persian officials would be easy and profitable, and facing the consequences of that failure along with a tangle of personal and political motivations that ancient sources describe somewhat inconsistently, he made the fateful decision to incite rebellion against Persian rule rather than face accountability for his failure. He appealed to Athens and Eretria for support, and remarkably, the Athenians, then a relatively young democracy that had only recently overthrown its own tyranny, agreed to send ships and soldiers to assist the Ionian Greek cities in their rebellion against Persian authority, a decision that Herodotus, with characteristic dramatic flourish, describes as the beginning of evils for both Greeks and barbarians. The rebels achieved an early and provocative success, marching inland and burning the city of Sardis, the former Lydian capital that now served as a major Persian regional center, including the destruction of a temple to the local mother goddess Cybele, an act of sacrilege that Persian sources and later Persian policy would specifically remember and cite as justification for subsequent retaliation against Greek temples. The revolt itself, however, ultimately failed. Persian forces methodically reconquered the rebellious Ionian cities over the following years, culminating in a decisive naval victory at the Battle of Ladi in 494 BCE and the brutal punitive destruction of Miletus itself, with much of its population killed, enslaved, or deported. A harsh reminder that Persian tolerance for local autonomy had real limits when that autonomy turned into open rebellion against the king's authority. But the Ionian revolt's most lasting consequence was not its outcome in Ionia, but the fact that Athens had intervened directly in what the Persian king Darius regarded as an internal imperial matter, providing direct military assistance to rebels against legitimate Persian authority. From the Persian perspective, this demanded a response, both to punish Athens specifically and to secure the empire's western frontier against future interference from mainland Greek states. The first Persian expedition against mainland Greece, in 492 BCE, led by Darius's son-in-law Mardonius, achieved the subjugation of Thrace and Macedon, but was effectively halted when the Persian fleet suffered catastrophic losses in a storm while attempting to round the notoriously dangerous promontory of Mount Athos, a setback that delayed but did not abandon Persian ambitions in the region. 2 years later, in 490 BCE, a second and considerably larger expedition crossed the Aegean directly, this time commanded by the Median general Datis, with the specific goal of punishing Athens and Eretria for their role in the Ionian revolt. After successfully capturing and brutally punishing Eretria, the Persian force landed at the plain of Marathon, roughly 26 miles from Athens, setting the stage for one of the most celebrated battles in all of military history. The Athenian army, significantly outnumbered according to most ancient accounts, though the precise figures remain genuinely debated among historians, with Persian forces likely numbering somewhere in the range of 25,000, and Athenian and allied Plataean forces, probably around 10,000, made the audacious decision to attack rather than wait passively for a siege or a larger confrontation closer to the city. Under the command of the general Miltiades, the Athenians weakened their center deliberately while strengthening their flanks, and when the battle began, the Persian center initially pushed through the weakened Athenian middle, but the strengthened Athenian flanks then wheeled inward, encircling the advancing Persian center in a tactical maneuver that proved devastatingly effective. The Persian forces broke and fled to their ships, suffering, according to Herodotus's account, roughly 6,400 casualties compared to just 192 Athenian dead, a casualty ratio so lopsided that it has fueled centuries of mythologizing about Greek martial superiority, even though modern military historians note that ancient battle casualty figures, particularly for the losing side, were frequently exaggerated for propaganda purposes, and that the battle's outcome owed as much to tactical innovation and Persian logistical disadvantages, fighting far from home with a force that included significant numbers of allied troops with mixed motivation, as to any inherent superiority of Greek soldiers over Persian ones. Marathon mattered enormously to Athenian identity and to the later Western historical imagination, becoming a foundational myth of Greek freedom, triumphing over Asian despotism. But it is worth pausing to note how this framing distorts the actual strategic picture from the Persian perspective. Marathon was a localized military setback in a punitive expedition against a single rebellious city, not an existential threat to the Persian Empire, which continued to control territory and populations vastly larger than the entirety of mainland Greece combined. Darius, according to Herodotus, was reportedly enraged by the defeat and began preparing an even larger expedition to properly subjugate Greece once and for all. But internal rebellion in Egypt diverted his attention, and Darius died in 486 BCE before he could launch this planned campaign, leaving the unfinished business of Greece and the burning personal motivation to avenge his father's setback to his son and successor, Xerxes. Xerxes I inherited a throne that, like so many Achaemenid successions before his, required him to first secure his position through suppressing rebellion, dealing with renewed unrest in both Egypt and Babylon during the early years of his reign, before he could turn his attention to the unfinished Greek campaign his father had left behind. The invasion Xerxes assembled between 481 and 480 BCE was, by ancient standards, an almost unimaginable logistical undertaking, drawing levies and contingents from across the entire breadth of the empire: Persians, Medes, Bactrians, Indians, Ethiopians, Egyptians, and dozens of other peoples, supported by a massive naval contingent provided primarily by Phoenician and Egyptian subjects with established maritime traditions. Herodotus famously claims the invasion force numbered well over 1 million soldiers, a figure that essentially every modern historian rejects as wildly exaggerated, since the logistics of feeding, watering, and moving a force of that size through the terrain involved would have been utterly impossible given the agricultural and transportation technology available at the time. Modern scholarly estimates vary considerably, but most place the actual invasion force somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 combined military personnel, including naval crews. Still an absolutely massive force for the ancient world, and almost certainly the largest single military expedition assembled up to that point in history, but a far cry from Herodotus's millions. To support this expedition, Xerxes undertook engineering projects of genuine spectacle and ambition, including a canal cut through the Athos Peninsula, specifically to avoid the kind of catastrophic naval losses that had doomed the earlier expedition under Mardonius, and a pontoon bridge of lashed-together boats spanning the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe, allowing the massive land army to cross without the delay and risk of ferrying troops across by ship. Herodotus describes an episode, almost certainly embellished for dramatic effect, but reflecting something of the genuine scale and ambition of the undertaking, in which an early version of this bridge was destroyed by a storm, and an enraged Xerxes ordered the Hellespont itself symbolically whipped and branded as punishment for its insolence. A story that, true or not, captures something of how this campaign was remembered as an almost cosmic confrontation between human ambition and the forces of nature and fate. The land campaign that followed the crossing of the Hellespont produced the single most mythologized engagement in the entire history of Greco-Persian conflict, the battle at Thermopylae, a narrow coastal pass in central Greece chosen by the Greek defenders specifically because its geography, a tight corridor between mountains and sea, neutralized the Persian advantage in sheer numbers by preventing the kind of broad encirclement that had worked so well for Greek forces at Marathon, but in reverse, this time protecting the smaller force. The defending Greek coalition, commanded by the Spartan king Leonidas and including, despite the popular modern image fixated almost entirely on 300 Spartans, several thousand troops from various Greek city-states, including Thespians, Thebans, and others, held the pass for 2 full days against repeated Persian assaults, including against Persian forces that reportedly included the elite Immortals, an elite infantry corps central to Persian military tradition. The defenders' position was ultimately compromised not through frontal defeat, but through betrayal or simple military intelligence, depending on how you read the sources, when a local Greek named Ephialtes revealed to Xerxes the existence of a mountain path called the Anopeia that allowed Persian forces to circle around and attack the Greek position from behind. Facing encirclement, Leonidas reportedly sent the bulk of the Greek coalition forces to retreat and fight another day, while he and a remaining force, including his 300 Spartans and several hundred Thespians who chose to stay rather than abandon the defense, fought to the death in a final stand that has become one of the most celebrated examples of military sacrifice in Western cultural memory. From a purely strategic standpoint, Thermopylae was a Persian victory. The pass was taken, the road to Athens lay open, and the Persian advance continued essentially unhindered. But the symbolic impact on Greek morale and on the later narrative of the war proved to be immense, transforming a tactical defeat into a foundational story of heroic resistance against overwhelming odds that would be retold, reinterpreted, and mythologized for the next 2,500 years, eventually becoming a kind of cultural shorthand for democratic resistance against tyranny, even though Sparta itself, it is worth remembering, was not remotely a democracy, but rather a rigidly militaristic society built on the brutal subjugation of an enslaved population called Helots, a detail conveniently omitted from the simplified version of this story that has dominated popular Western memory. With the land route to Athens secured, Xerxes occupied and burned the city, which had been evacuated by its population in anticipation of exactly this outcome. A strategic decision that preserved Athenian manpower and naval capacity at the cost of the city itself, a calculated sacrifice that would prove decisive in the campaign's ultimate outcome. The Greek coalition's combined fleet, gathered in the narrow straits near the island of Salamis, faced a critical strategic decision about whether to risk a naval engagement against the numerically superior Persian fleet or withdraw further south to defend the Peloponnese directly. The Athenian commander Themistocles argued forcefully for fighting at Salamis specifically because the narrow, confined waters of the strait would neutralize the Persian fleet's numerical advantage, much as the geography at Thermopylae had been chosen to limit the impact of Persian numbers on land, preventing the larger Persian fleet from maneuvering effectively or bringing its full force to bear simultaneously. According to several ancient accounts, Themistocles even arranged for a deceptive message to be sent to Xerxes, suggesting the Greek fleet was on the verge of fleeing in disarray, encouraging the Persians to commit to battle in the strait rather than waiting for a more advantageous position. Among the most fascinating figures present at this battle was Artemisia, queen of the Anatolian city-state of Halicarnassus, who commanded her own ships as part of the Persian naval coalition and who Herodotus, in one of the relatively rare moments where a woman receives sustained, respectful attention in ancient military narrative, describes as offering Xerxes shrewd strategic counsel, reportedly advising him to avoid a naval engagement altogether given the disadvantageous conditions, advice that Xerxes ultimately did not follow. When the battle commenced in the narrow waters of Salamis in September of 480 BCE, the confined space proved just as disastrous for the Persian fleet as Themistocles had calculated. With ships unable to maneuver effectively, colliding with one another, and being picked apart by the more nimble Greek triremes, resulting in a decisive Greek naval victory that fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the entire campaign, since Persian land forces in Greece depended heavily on naval support for supply lines, and the loss at Salamis severely compromised that logistical foundation. Following the defeat at Salamis, Xerxes made the decision to return to Persia himself, leaving his general Mardonius in command of a substantial land force to continue the campaign the following year. A decision that some ancient and modern observers have interpreted as evidence of Xerxes prioritizing the security of his own person and his broader empire over personal involvement in what had become an increasingly uncertain Greek campaign. A perfectly reasonable strategic calculation for a king who, after all, governed a territory far larger than Greece and could not afford to be absent indefinitely from the administrative and political center of his empire. The campaign's final decisive engagement came in 479 BCE at the Battle of Plataea, where a combined Greek army, finally unified at a scale and with a coordination that had not been consistently achieved earlier in the war, faced Mardonius's forces in a battle that, after a tense period of maneuvering and skirmishing, resulted in a decisive Greek victory and the death of Mardonius himself. Coordinated with a Greek naval victory at Mycale on the Anatolian coast around the same time, which encouraged renewed Ionian Greek rebellion against Persian rule, the defeats at Plataea and Mycale effectively ended the immediate Persian threat to mainland Greece and marked the high water mark of Achaemenid westward expansion. It is crucial to understand, however, what this actually meant in the broader context of the empire. Persia had failed to conquer mainland Greece, a genuinely significant strategic setback and an undeniable blow to royal prestige, but the Achaemenid Empire itself remained, by an enormous margin, the wealthiest, largest, and most powerful state in the entire ancient world, continuing to control Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, Anatolia, and Central Asia for another century and a half after these battles. The Greco-Persian Wars, which occupy such a disproportionate share of popular historical memory about ancient Persia, represented a relatively contained frontier conflict on the empire's western edge, not an existential crisis that meaningfully threatened the core structures of Achaemenid power, a perspective almost entirely absent from the traditional Western narrative, which, understandably given that narrative's Greek origins, treats these wars as the central drama of the era, rather than as the peripheral episode they actually were from the vantage point of Susa or Persepolis. It is worth stopping here to examine something genuinely important about how we know what we know about ancient Persia, because the entire shape of popular historical memory regarding this empire has been distorted by an accident of historiography that most people never stop to consider. Our most detailed narrative sources for Achaemenid history were written almost exclusively by Greek authors, Herodotus, Xenophon, Ctesias, and later Roman-era writers drawing on Greek traditions. And these were people writing from within a cultural and political context that had every incentive to portray Persia in specific, often unflattering ways. Herodotus, often called the father of history and certainly a meticulous collector of information by the standards of his era, nonetheless wrote within a Greek intellectual framework that increasingly constructed a binary opposition between Greek freedom and Persian despotism, Greek rationality and Persian excess, Greek manly self-discipline and Persian effeminate luxury, a set of cultural stereotypes that scholars now often group under the term Orientalism, referring to a pattern identified and analyzed extensively in modern academic work of Western societies constructing exoticized, often demeaning caricatures of Eastern civilizations that serve to define Western identity through contrast rather than to accurately describe the societies being depicted. This does not mean Herodotus invented everything he wrote, and in fact, modern archaeological and Persian administrative sources have confirmed many specific details in his accounts. But it does mean that his overall interpretive framework, the lens through which he selected, arranged, and explained Persian behavior and Persian institutions, was shaped by Greek cultural assumptions and Greek political needs in the aftermath of a war Greece had, against considerable odds, managed to survive and ultimately mythologize as a triumph of civilizational values rather than simply a military and logistical outcome. Consider just how lopsided our source material actually is. We have almost no surviving Persian literary narrative describing these events from a Persian perspective, since the Achaemenid administrative tradition, while sophisticated in producing royal inscriptions, tribute records, and bureaucratic documentation, did not produce the kind of extended historical or biographical narrative that Greek culture happened to develop and preserve. This creates an almost unavoidable interpretive trap. When historians today try to reconstruct Achaemenid history, they are overwhelmingly forced to read between the lines of hostile, or at minimum culturally biased Greek sources, supplemented by Persian administrative documents that, while invaluable, were never designed to provide the kind of narrative political history that a modern reader instinctively wants. The result has been centuries of Western historical writing that essentially adopted Herodotus's interpretive framework wholesale, treating Persia as a backdrop against which Greek heroism could be measured, rather than as a civilization worth understanding and explaining on its own terms and according to its own internal logic. Only in recent decades, particularly through groundbreaking work analyzing the Persepolis fortification tablets and other primary Persian administrative sources, alongside more critical and methodologically sophisticated readings of the Greek sources themselves that account for their inherent biases, has a richer and more accurate picture of Achaemenid civilization begun to emerge in academic scholarship, even as popular culture, through films, books, and casual historical references, continues to lag behind, recycling essentially the same 2,500-year-old Greek stereotypes about decadent Oriental tyranny. Some of the most persistent and demonstrably inaccurate misconceptions deserve direct correction. The idea that Persian kings ruled through pure capricious tyranny with no meaningful checks on their power collapses under examination of the actual administrative record, which reveals an empire governed through codified law, established bureaucratic procedure, and a genuine, functioning legal system that, while certainly autocratic at its apex in ways no modern person would recognize as democratic, nonetheless operated according to consistent and predictable rules rather than arbitrary royal whim, with administrative archives showing legal disputes resolved through established courts and procedures across the empire, including documented cases of ordinary subjects bringing grievances against officials and receiving formal legal hearings. The popular image of Persian society as fundamentally decadent, weak, and morally corrupted, an image that Greek sources eagerly cultivated and that has persisted through countless later retellings, sits awkwardly alongside the empire's actual military and administrative record, since a genuinely decadent and weak society does not typically conquer and successfully govern the largest territorial empire the world had yet seen for over 2 centuries, defeating established powers like the Median, Lydian, Babylonian, and Egyptian states along the way, and maintaining administrative cohesion across 3 continents through multiple royal successions, some of them violent and contested. The frequent depiction of Persian armies as undisciplined hordes, relying purely on overwhelming numbers, ignores the genuine sophistication of Persian military organization, including elite units like the Immortals. Effective use of cavalry, particularly from horse-rich regions like Media and Bactria, and combined arms tactics integrating infantry, cavalry, and naval power drawn from subject peoples with specialized maritime expertise, a level of military organizational complexity that simply does not align with the simplistic image of an undisciplined mass relying on sheer weight of numbers. And the broader characterization of Persian rule as harshly oppressive toward conquered peoples sits in direct tension with the considerable evidence already discussed: the restoration of Jewish exiles and temple rebuilding, the preservation of Babylonian and Egyptian religious institutions, the retention of local elites, and administrative continuity across the empire's diverse regions. Evidence that points toward a system of governance built more around calculated accommodation and the cultivation of local cooperation than around the kind of brutal cultural suppression that later imperial powers, including some that explicitly modeled themselves on romanticized notions of Rome, would actually practice. Returning to the narrative of Achaemenid political history, Xerxes himself would not live to see the empire he ruled recover fully from the setbacks in Greece, as he was assassinated in 465 BCE in a palace conspiracy involving Artabanus, the commander of his royal bodyguard, an episode that illustrates a recurring vulnerability in Achaemenid succession. Despite the empire's sophisticated administrative machinery, the transfer of supreme royal power remained perpetually exposed to the dangers of court intrigue, since the same concentration of authority that allowed the king to govern efficiently also made him a single, vulnerable point of failure, whose death could trigger succession crises, threatening the stability of the entire imperial structure. Xerxes was succeeded by his son Artaxerxes I, whose reign, lasting from 465 to 424 BCE, proved considerably less dramatic in terms of military conflict with Greece, but nonetheless significant, including the events described in the biblical books of Ezra and Nehemiah, regarding continued Persian support for the Jewish community in Jerusalem. With Nehemiah serving as a Persian-appointed governor, tasked specifically with overseeing the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls, a clear example of the kind of pragmatic, locally calibrated administrative policy that characterized Achaemenid rule at its most functional. The decades following Artaxerxes I's death witnessed a series of succession struggles and shorter reigns, including the brief rule of Xerxes II, who was murdered within months of taking the throne, and Darius II, whose reign was marked by continued instability and growing reliance on the empire's western satraps to manage an increasingly complex relationship with the now fractious and frequently warring Greek city-states. With Persian gold and diplomatic support flowing to whichever Greek faction, Athens or Sparta, seemed most useful for Persian strategic interests at any given moment. A policy of calculated interference that allowed Persia to recover much of its influence over Greek affairs without the costly direct military commitment that Xerxes' great invasion had required, demonstrating that Achaemenid statecraft, even in a period of internal challenges, retained considerable strategic sophistication. Artaxerxes II, who ruled for an unusually long period from 404 to 358 BCE, faced one of the most dramatic internal challenges to Achaemenid authority in the empire's history, when his younger brother Cyrus the Younger, serving as a satrap in Anatolia, raised a rebellion that included a substantial force of Greek mercenaries, an episode immortalized in considerable detail by the Greek historian and soldier Xenophon, who actually participated in the campaign and later wrote a detailed account called the Anabasis. Cyrus the Younger's rebellion culminated in the Battle of Cunaxa in 401 BCE, where Cyrus was killed despite his forces achieving significant tactical success, leaving his Greek mercenary contingent, the famous 10,000, stranded deep in hostile Persian territory and forced to fight their way back to the Black Sea coast through hundreds of miles of difficult terrain, an extraordinary military feat that Xenophon's account preserved for posterity, and that, centuries later, would even reportedly influence Alexander the Great's own thinking about the practical feasibility of campaigning deep into Persian territory. This rebellion, ultimately unsuccessful, nonetheless revealed something important about the structural vulnerabilities embedded within the satrapy system. Since the same administrative decentralization that allowed the empire to function efficiently across such vast distances also gave ambitious satraps, particularly those with royal blood, and access to substantial military and financial resources, genuine opportunities to challenge central authority when succession disputes or perceived weakness at the center created openings for rebellion. Beneath all this political and military history lies a religious tradition that profoundly shaped Persian civilization and that deserves far more attention than it typically receives in popular accounts of the ancient world. Zoroastrianism, one of the oldest continuously practiced religions on earth, and a faith whose theological concepts would go on to influence Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in ways that most people never realize. The religion traces its origins to a prophet named Zarathustra, known to the Greeks as Zoroaster, whose actual historical dates remain genuinely uncertain and debated among scholars, with estimates ranging anywhere from around 1500 BCE to as late as 600 BCE, a remarkably wide range that reflects just how difficult it is to pin down details about a figure who left behind religious poetry, the Gathas, composed in an extremely archaic form of the Avestan language, but no contemporary historical documentation of the conventional sort. What we can reconstruct from these hymns suggests that Zarathustra preached a message centered on Ahura Mazda, described as a single supreme deity associated with wisdom, truth, and light, a theological move that some scholars characterize as an early and influential form of monotheism, or at least a strongly monotheistic-leaning system, emerging in a Near Eastern religious landscape otherwise dominated by polytheistic traditions involving large pantheons of competing gods. Central to Zoroastrian theology is a cosmic struggle between Asha, a concept encompassing truth, order, and righteousness, and Druj, representing falsehood and chaos. A moral framework that cast human beings as active participants with genuine free will and moral responsibility in an ongoing cosmic battle between good and evil, rather than passive subjects of divine whims dispensed by capricious gods. A theological framework that represented a significant innovation in how ancient peoples conceptualized morality, ethics, and the relationship between human choice and cosmic order. It is important to note that the relationship between the Achaemenid kings and formal Zoroastrian religious practice remains a subject of genuine scholarly debate, since the precise degree to which Cyrus, Darius, and their successors practiced what we would recognize as orthodox Zoroastrianism, as opposed to a related but distinct Persian religious tradition that shared common ancestry and overlapping concepts without being fully identical to the faith that would later be systematized, is not entirely settled. Royal inscriptions consistently invoke Ahura Mazda as the supreme god who granted kingship and victory to the Achaemenid rulers, a clear theological claim establishing divine sanction for royal authority. But these same inscriptions show relatively little explicit reference to other specific elements that would become central to later, more fully developed Zoroastrian orthodoxy, leading many scholars to conclude that the Achaemenid kings practiced a form of Persian religion that was closely related to and clearly influenced by Zarathustra's teachings without necessarily representing a fully standardized, textually fixed religious system in the way Zoroastrianism would eventually become under later Sasanian Persian rule, centuries after the Achaemenid period had ended. Regardless of these scholarly nuances, the broader theological framework, the emphasis on truth, and the active human duty to oppose falsehood and chaos clearly permeates royal Achaemenid ideology. With Darius's Behistun inscription explicitly framing his political opponents and rebels not merely as rivals for power, but as liars who had embraced Druj, the cosmic principle of falsehood, casting the king's military and political struggles in explicitly moral and even cosmic terms rather than simply as contests for worldly power. Zoroastrian and broader Persian religious practice centered significantly on fire as a sacred symbol representing purity, truth, and the divine presence of Ahura Mazda, leading to the development of fire temples. Sacred spaces where a continuously maintained flame served as the focal point of ritual and worship, tended by priests called magi, a term that, through Greek transliteration and later cultural transmission, would eventually enter English as the word magi still used today, most famously in the biblical account of the wise men who visit the infant Jesus, themselves likely intended by the gospel writers to represent Persian or Babylonian astrologer priests. A small but striking example of how deeply Persian religious culture had penetrated the broader cultural and linguistic consciousness of the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. Zoroastrian funerary practices, including the avoidance of burying or cremating the dead in order to prevent contaminating the sacred elements of earth and fire, eventually led to distinctive practices like exposure of the dead in specially constructed structures, though the full elaboration of these practices, particularly the later development of dogmas, or towers of silence, appears to have crystallized more fully in the centuries after the Achaemenid period, during Sasanian times. The broader concept of an ongoing struggle between good and evil, the eventual triumph of order over chaos, and ideas about judgment, an afterlife, and even, in some interpretations of later Zoroastrian texts, a final apocalyptic renovation of the world, have led numerous scholars to argue for significant Zoroastrian influence on the development of post-exilic Jewish theology, particularly concepts around angels, a more developed adversarial figure eventually associated with evil, and apocalyptic and eschatological thinking that becomes considerably more prominent in Jewish religious literature composed during and after the period of Persian rule over Judea, ideas that would subsequently flow into Christian and Islamic theology as well, making Zoroastrianism, despite its relatively small number of adherents in the modern world, one of the most quietly influential religious traditions in all of human history. Its theological DNA embedded within the major monotheistic faiths that would eventually eclipse it numerically while never fully escaping its conceptual shadow. Music, too, played a documented role in Achaemenid court and religious life, though our evidence here is frustratingly indirect, since no musical notation survives from the period. Greek and later Persian sources describe court musicians and singers as a regular feature of royal banquets and ceremonial occasions, and reliefs from Persepolis depicting figures carrying what appear to be lyre-like instruments suggest that music accompanied the great tribute processions and royal festivals held there, while religious hymns, including the gathas attributed to Zarathustra himself, were composed in a metrical, clearly musical form intended for ritual chanting rather than silent reading, indicating that sound and performance were woven into Persian religious practice from its earliest roots. Persian artistic and architectural achievement extended well beyond the famous ceremonial structures at Persepolis, reflecting a sophisticated visual culture that, much like Persian governance itself, drew deliberately and skillfully on the artistic traditions of conquered and absorbed peoples while developing distinctive features of its own. Achaemenid metalwork, particularly in gold and silver, produced objects of extraordinary craftsmanship, including elaborate drinking vessels shaped like animal heads called rhyta, intricate jewelry, and the famous Oxus treasure, a remarkable collection of gold and silver objects discovered in the 19th century along the Oxus River in Central Asia, providing invaluable evidence of the artistic sophistication achieved across the empire's eastern territories far from the more famous central sites. Persian seal carving, used extensively in administrative contexts to authenticate documents and mark ownership, reached a level of miniature artistic detail that continues to impress specialists in ancient gem carving. With cylinder seals depicting royal hunting scenes, mythological creatures, and religious symbolism executed with remarkable precision on objects sometimes barely larger than a fingernail. In terms of broader cultural and intellectual contributions, the Achaemenid period, while perhaps not producing the kind of extended philosophical or scientific literary tradition that later Greek civilization would become famous for, nonetheless fostered considerable advances in practical knowledge, particularly in astronomy and mathematics, building on and transmitting Babylonian astronomical traditions that had developed sophisticated methods for tracking celestial movements and predicting astronomical events. Knowledge that would later flow into Greek scientific tradition partly through the cultural contact and exchange that Persian imperial unification of the Near East had facilitated. A frequently overlooked channel of intellectual transmission that complicates the simplistic narrative crediting Greek civilization with developing scientific thought in cultural isolation from its Near Eastern neighbors. Religious and artistic achievement, however, was only one dimension of imperial strength, and it's worth examining Persian military organization in more detail because the popular image of Persian armies as undisciplined masses obscures genuinely sophisticated military institutions that evolved over the empire's long history. The Immortals, described by Herodotus as an elite corps numbering exactly 10,000 men, formed a core standing force distinct from the levied provincial troops that made up the bulk of any major campaign army. And while Herodotus's specific claims about this unit, including the colorful detail that their numbers were always maintained at precisely 10,000 through immediate replacement of any casualties, may reflect some degree of literary flourish, archaeological evidence from Persepolis itself, particularly the relief carvings depicting royal guard units in distinctive uniform dress carrying spears and wicker shields, supports the existence of a genuinely elite, professionally maintained royal guard force that served both ceremonial functions at court and as a reliable military corps during campaigns. Persian cavalry, drawing on the deep equestrian traditions of Media and other horse-rich regions of the Iranian plateau, provided a battlefield capability that many of the empire's opponents, particularly Greek city-states whose military tradition centered overwhelmingly on heavily armored infantry, simply could not match in open terrain. A tactical reality that helps explain why so many of the most famous Greek victories against Persian forces, Marathon, Thermopylae, occurred specifically in constrained geographic settings, narrow passes, defended beaches, confined straits, that neutralized Persian cavalry and naval numerical advantages, while Persian forces tended to perform considerably better in open engagements, where their full combined arms capability could be properly deployed. a pattern that should give modern readers pause before accepting the simplistic narrative that Greek martial superiority alone explains the outcomes of these famous battles. The broader question of how Persians themselves likely viewed the conflicts with Greece, as opposed to how Greek sources portrayed them, requires careful inference since, as already discussed, we lack extensive surviving Persian narrative accounts of these events. But the available evidence, royal inscriptions, the relative administrative continuity of the empire following these conflicts, and the simple scale comparison between Greece and the broader empire suggests that from the Persian royal perspective, the wars in Greece likely registered as a frustrating but fundamentally peripheral setback rather than a civilization-defining catastrophe. Darius and Xerxes continued to rule, and their successors continued to govern, an empire that still encompassed Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, Anatolia, and Central Asia, still collected tribute from dozens of subject peoples, and still maintained the sophisticated administrative and communication infrastructure that had made Achaemenid governance so effective for another century and a half after Plataea and Mycale. The failure to conquer mainland Greece certainly represented a real check on Persian ambitions and likely did damage royal prestige in ways that historians can trace through subsequent internal rebellions and the empire's shift toward a strategy of managing Greek affairs through diplomacy, subsidies, and calculated support for whichever faction served Persian interests, rather than renewed direct military invasion. But this represents a meaningful strategic adjustment, not the kind of existential civilizational crisis that the Greek-centered narrative tradition has tended to imply. And it's worth remembering that this same Persian Empire would go on to survive for another 150 years after these famous defeats, continuing to be the dominant power in the entire Eastern Mediterranean and Near Eastern world throughout that period, a fact that the popular emphasis on Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis as supposedly civilization-saving turning points tends to obscure rather dramatically. Some genuinely surprising facts about the empire deserve highlighting precisely because they run so counter to popular assumptions. The Achaemenid postal and courier system, the Angarion already described, operated with such reliability that it became proverbial in the ancient world for unstoppable, swift communication, and the underlying relay principle, fresh riders and fresh horses at regular intervals rather than a single exhausted courier, would not be meaningfully improved upon until the development of dedicated postal services many centuries later. The empire's approach to weights and measures involved genuine standardization efforts across its territories, facilitating trade and taxation in ways that reduced the friction and uncertainty that typically plagued commerce across different political jurisdictions in the ancient world. Perhaps most strikingly, the administrative tablets from Persepolis reveal a bureaucracy so meticulous that it tracked individual rations down to specific quantities of wine, beer, and grain allocated to named or titled individuals traveling on official business, a level of granular record-keeping that demonstrates a state apparatus far more procedurally sophisticated than the popular image of Oriental despotism, ruled purely by royal whim and arbitrary decree, would ever suggest. And the religious tolerance that characterized Achaemenid rule, while certainly not identical to modern secular pluralism and definitely not without exceptions during periods of rebellion or political crisis, nonetheless represented a genuinely distinctive approach to empire that set Persia apart from many of its imperial predecessors and contemporaries, an approach whose practical wisdom, governing diverse populations through accommodation rather than forced homogenization, would echo forward through the Parthian and Sasanian successor states and eventually into the administrative practices of the Islamic caliphates that followed, carrying this distinctly Persian philosophy of governance forward across more than a millennium of subsequent Near Eastern and Central Asian history. Long after the last Achaemenid king had been betrayed and killed by his own treacherous satrap in a remote eastern province, far from the golden halls of Persepolis where this entire extraordinary story had once begun. By the middle of the 4th century BCE, the Achaemenid Empire, while still controlling an enormous territory and considerable wealth, was showing genuine signs of internal strain that, with the benefit of hindsight, historians can identify as warning signs of eventual vulnerability, even though no one living through these events could have predicted just how quickly and completely the empire would ultimately collapse. Repeated satrapal rebellions, sometimes called the Great Satraps' Revolt during the reign of Artaxerxes II, saw multiple regional governors in Anatolia and elsewhere challenge central authority, reflecting ongoing tension between the centralizing instincts of the imperial court and the genuine autonomous power that ambitious satraps could accumulate, particularly in distant frontier provinces. Egypt, always one of the empire's most valuable but also most rebellious territories given its own ancient and proud pharaonic traditions, successfully broke away from Persian control for several decades, beginning around 404 BCE, establishing independent native Egyptian dynasties before finally being reconquered by Artaxerxes III around 343 BCE. A reconquest that, while restoring Persian control, also reportedly involved harsh punitive measures that further strained relations between the Persian crown and its Egyptian subjects. Court intrigue and violent succession struggles continued to plague the dynasty, with Artaxerxes III himself reportedly poisoned in a palace conspiracy around 338 BCE, followed by the brief and chaotic reign of his son Artaxerxes IV, who was in turn murdered, leading to the elevation of Darius III, a member of a collateral branch of the royal family, to the throne in 336 BCE, under circumstances that remain debated, but that clearly reflect a pattern of dynastic instability and court violence that had become disturbingly routine by this point in Achaemenid history. None of this instability alone would necessarily have doomed the empire, since Persia had weathered succession crises and regional rebellions throughout its history and consistently recovered. But it meant that when a genuinely unprecedented external threat finally materialized, the empire's leadership and institutional cohesion were perhaps less robust than they had been under the more capable rulers of earlier generations. That unprecedented threat emerged from a kingdom that the Achaemenid court had, for most of its history, regarded as a peripheral and relatively unsophisticated power on the fringes of the Greek world, Macedon. Under King Philip II, who came to power in 359 BCE, this previously marginal kingdom underwent a transformation, with Philip developing a revolutionary military system built around the sarissa, an extraordinarily long pike that gave Macedonian infantry formations a reach advantage over conventional Greek hoplite armies, combined with a sophisticated integration of cavalry, particularly the elite companion cavalry, and combined arms tactics that Philip refined through years of campaigning that brought the various Greek city-states through a combination of military pressure and shrewd diplomacy under Macedonian hegemony, culminating in the decisive Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, where Philip's forces defeated a coalition including Athens and Thebes, effectively ending genuine Greek city-state independence and establishing Macedonian dominance over the Greek mainland. Philip had reportedly already begun planning a campaign against Persia, framed partly as a pan-Hellenic crusade of liberation and revenge for the Persian invasions of the previous century, when he was assassinated in 336 BCE, under circumstances that remain genuinely murky and subject to ongoing historical debate, leaving this ambitious project, along with the kingdom and the formidable military machine he had built, to his 20-year-old son, a young man whose name would soon become inseparable from the final destruction of the Achaemenid Empire, Alexander. Alexander crossed into Asia in 334 BCE with a force that, while considerably smaller than the massive multinational armies the Achaemenid kings had historically been able to muster, possessed a degree of tactical sophistication, cohesion, and battlefield experience that would prove devastatingly effective against Persian forces that, despite their numerical advantages and genuine military traditions, had not faced an opponent quite like this combined Macedonian system before. The first major engagement came at the Granicus River in northwestern Anatolia, where Persian satraps and their forces, notably without King Darius III himself present, attempted to halt Alexander's advance at a river crossing, a battle that, despite featuring a moment of genuine personal danger for Alexander himself, who was nearly killed in close combat and saved by the timely intervention of his companion Cletus, ultimately resulted in a decisive Macedonian victory that opened the way for Alexander to advance through Anatolia, largely unopposed, liberating, or in Persian terms, simply conquering. The Greek cities along the Ionian coast that had remained under Persian control for nearly 2 centuries since the failed Ionian revolt. This time, Darius III decided the threat warranted his personal command, and the two armies met at Issus in 333 BCE in a narrow coastal plain in what is now southeastern Turkey, terrain that, much like at Thermopylae nearly a century and a half earlier, constrained the battlefield in ways that limited the Persian army's ability to fully deploy its numerical superiority. The battle turned dramatically when Alexander's cavalry broke through the Persian left flank and threatened to encircle the royal center. And Darius III, faced with the imminent collapse of his position, made the fateful decision to flee the battlefield, reportedly abandoning his chariot, his royal cloak, and even members of his own family, including his mother, wife, and children, who were subsequently captured by Alexander's forces, an episode that ancient sources, including later Roman-era writers, would treat with considerable narrative interest, describing Alexander's notably respectful and even chivalrous treatment of the captured Persian royal women, a detail that, whether entirely accurate or partly idealized for the sake of Alexander's heroic later reputation, nonetheless illustrates how thoroughly the conflict had shifted from a contest between roughly comparable powers into something approaching the systematic dismantling of Achaemenid authority. After Issus, Alexander spent considerable time consolidating his control over the Levantine coast and Egypt, partly for strategic reasons, securing his supply lines and naval flanks before pushing deeper into the Persian heartland, and partly, in Egypt's case, because the famously rebellious Egyptian population, having endured generations of Persian rule, punctuated by periods of independence and harsh reconquest, welcomed Alexander as a liberator, and Alexander shrewdly cultivated this welcome, having himself crowned pharaoh and visiting the Oracle of Amun at the Siwa Oasis, a piece of careful political theater designed to legitimize his rule in specifically Egyptian religious and cultural terms, demonstrating that Alexander, whatever his ultimate ambitions, understood something about the value of working with existing local power structures and religious traditions, rather than simply imposing foreign rule by brute force, a lesson that, ironically, echoed the very Achaemenid administrative philosophy he was in the process of dismantling. Darius III, meanwhile, used the time to assemble what would be his final and largest army, drawing levies from across the remaining breadth of the empire, including notably scythed chariots and war elephants intended to counter the tactical advantages Alexander's forces had demonstrated in previous engagements. And the two forces finally met for their decisive confrontation at Gaugamela, near modern Mosul, in northern Iraq, in October of 331 BCE. Gaugamela represented Darius III's best and final opportunity to halt the Macedonian advance, fought on terrain that the Persian king had specifically selected and prepared in advance, a wide-open plain that, unlike the constrained battlefields at Granicus and Issus, allowed Persian forces to deploy their full numerical advantage and make proper use of their cavalry and chariot forces. Ancient sources, with their usual tendency toward exaggeration regarding Persian troop numbers, describe forces in the hundreds of thousands or even over 1 million, figures that modern historians treat with the same skepticism applied to Herodotus's accounts of Xerxes' invasion force, with more sober estimates suggesting Darius commanded a substantial but considerably smaller army, likely in the range of 50 to 100,000 troops against Alexander's force of around 47,000. Still a meaningful Persian numerical advantage, but nothing approaching the almost cartoonish disparities described in some ancient accounts. The battle itself showcased Alexander's tactical brilliance at its peak, as he deliberately extended his battle line to draw Persian cavalry away from the center, created a deliberate gap in the Persian line. Through this maneuvering, and then drove a concentrated cavalry wedge directly toward Darius's own position in a calculated gamble aimed not merely at winning a tactical victory, but at achieving the psychologically decisive outcome of forcing the Persian king himself to flee the field, which is precisely what happened when Darius, seeing Alexander's cavalry bearing down on his position and his own forces beginning to waver, once again abandoned the battlefield rather than risk capture or death, a decision that, whatever the immediate tactical logic, proved catastrophic for Persian morale and for Darius's own standing as a legitimate ruler capable of defending his empire and his throne. With the Persian field army shattered and Darius III in flight toward the eastern provinces, Alexander marched into the heart of the Achaemenid Empire, essentially unopposed, entering Babylon, where, much as Cyrus the Great had done nearly 2 centuries earlier, he was reportedly welcomed by local elites eager to ensure favorable treatment from the new conqueror, and proceeding to Susa, where he seized an almost unimaginable quantity of accumulated royal treasure, gold and silver bullion, that ancient sources describe in figures so large that, even allowing for typical ancient exaggeration, clearly represented the accumulated wealth of generations of Persian tribute collection from across the empire's vast territories. The most symbolically charged moment of the entire conquest came at Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Achaemenid royal identity, which Alexander's forces occupied, and where, after several months, a fire broke out that destroyed much of the magnificent palace complex, an event whose precise circumstances remain genuinely debated among historians. Some ancient accounts, including stories that were clearly popular in the later Hellenistic and Roman periods, describe the burning as a drunken, almost spontaneous act during a celebratory feast, sometimes specifically attributed to the influence of Alexander's companion and reported lover, the courtesan Thais, who allegedly incited the destruction as symbolic revenge for the Persian burning of Athens generations earlier during Xerxes' invasion. Other interpretations, taken more seriously by some modern historians, suggest the burning may have been a calculated political act, a deliberate statement marking the definitive end of Achaemenid royal legitimacy and signaling to the wider empire that Persian rule was finished and Alexander's new order had begun. Since destroying the specific ceremonial site most associated with Persian royal identity and the annual Nowruz tribute ceremony would have carried unmistakable symbolic weight regardless of whatever immediate drunken impulse might have provided the literal spark. Archaeological evidence does confirm that a significant fire did occur, and that portions of the complex, particularly certain palace structures, never recovered from this destruction, even though other parts of the site continued to see some use afterward, leaving us with definite physical evidence of catastrophic destruction, even as the precise human motivations behind it remain shrouded in the same kind of legendary embellishment that colors so much of ancient historical narrative. Darius III's final chapter unfolded as a tragedy of diminishing options and eroding loyalty. Having fled eastward into the Iranian heartland and then further into the empire's eastern satrapies, hoping perhaps to rally fresh forces from Bactria and the more remote provinces that Alexander had not yet reached, Darius found his authority increasingly hollow, since a king who had twice fled the battlefield rather than fight to the end had lost the kind of legitimacy that Achaemenid kingship, resting heavily on the ruler's demonstrated capacity to maintain order and project strength, fundamentally required. In 330 BCE, Darius was betrayed and captured by Bessus, one of his own satraps governing Bactria, who, recognizing that the last legitimate Achaemenid king had become more of a liability than an asset, had him killed, reportedly stabbed, and left to die before Alexander's pursuing forces could arrive. According to several ancient accounts, when Alexander finally caught up to the scene, he found Darius already dead or dying and treated the body with conspicuous formal respect, arranging for a royal burial appropriate to Darius's status as the last legitimate king of the Achaemenid line, a gesture that served Alexander's own political purposes by positioning himself not as a foreign invader who had simply destroyed Persian kingship, but as Darius's rightful successor inheriting a throne whose previous occupant had met an unworthy end at the hands of his own treacherous subject. A piece of political theater that allowed Alexander to begin presenting himself with increasing seriousness over subsequent years as a legitimate Persian great king rather than merely a Macedonian conqueror, even adopting elements of Persian royal dress and court ceremony that would eventually alienate some of his own more traditionally minded Macedonian and Greek officers. With Darius III's death, the Achaemenid dynasty that Cyrus the Great had founded roughly 2 centuries earlier came to its definitive end, even as Bessus himself briefly attempted to claim the kingship under the name Artaxerxes V before being captured and executed by Alexander's forces, closing the final chapter on Achaemenid royal pretensions and leaving Alexander as the undisputed master of an empire that, in its sheer geographic scope, dwarfed anything the Greek world had previously imagined possible, an irony not lost on later historians. The very scale and administrative sophistication that the Achaemenids had built was now simply transferred, largely intact in its provincial structure, into Alexander's own rapidly expanding and ultimately short-lived imperial project. Alexander's death in 323 BCE, just 8 years after the fall of Darius III, and without a clear adult heir to maintain unity, triggered decades of warfare among his former generals, the Diadochi, as they carved his enormous conquests into competing successor kingdoms, with the bulk of the former Achaemenid territory eventually consolidating under Seleucus I Nicator and his descendants, founders of what historians call the Seleucid Empire. The Seleucids, ruling from roughly 312 BCE onward, attempted to govern this vast inherited territory using a blend of Greek and Macedonian administrative concepts grafted onto the underlying Persian provincial infrastructure they had inherited, founding numerous Greek-style cities across the former Persian territories specifically intended to serve as administrative, military, and cultural anchors for Hellenistic rule, a process modern historians call Hellenization, though it's worth noting this process was always uneven and incomplete, with many regions, particularly in the Iranian plateau itself, retaining substantial Persian cultural, linguistic, and religious continuity beneath a thin veneer of Greek political administration. Seleucid control over the eastern Iranian territories proved especially difficult to maintain over the long term, beset by the same fundamental challenge that had always faced anyone attempting to govern this vast region from a distance: the sheer scale of the territory, the diversity of its peoples, and the perpetual temptation for ambitious regional governors or rising local powers to break away from central authority whenever that authority showed signs of weakness or distraction. That weakness eventually created an opening for one of the most significant, and in popular Western historical memory, most underappreciated successor states to emerge: the Parthian Empire. Founded by Arsaces I around 247 BCE, when he led a rebellion of the Parni, a nomadic Iranian people, against Seleucid authority in the region of Parthia in northeastern Iran. Over the following century, the Parthians, under capable rulers like Mithridates I, gradually expanded their control westward, eventually capturing Mesopotamia and effectively pushing Seleucid authority back into a much-reduced Syrian rump state, until the Parthian Empire came to control essentially the same Iranian and Mesopotamian heartland that had once formed the core of the Achaemenid state, even as the Parthians themselves, ethnically and culturally distinct from the earlier Achaemenid Persians, increasingly came to present themselves as legitimate heirs and restorers of the older Persian imperial tradition, adopting Achaemenid-style royal titles and consciously positioning their rule as a continuation of authentic Iranian kingship rather than merely another foreign successor state imposed from outside. The Parthian Empire's most consequential historical role came through its prolonged and often remarkably successful military confrontation with an emerging power to the west that, in a fascinating historical echo, found itself cast in a role disturbingly similar to the one Persia itself had once occupied in Greek imagination: Rome. The most famous Parthian military triumph came at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE, where Parthian forces under the general Shurena, employing devastating tactics, combining heavily armored cataphract cavalry with horse archers who exploited their superior mobility to harass and exhaust the Roman legions from a distance, annihilated a massive Roman invasion force commanded by Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in Roman history, who was killed in the aftermath. An utterly catastrophic defeat that sent shockwaves through Roman political and military thinking and established a pattern of grudging Roman respect mixed with frustrated inability to achieve decisive conquest over Parthian territory that would persist for the better part of 3 centuries. With Rome's eastern frontier against successive Persian states becoming one of the most persistent and costly strategic challenges the otherwise overwhelmingly successful Roman imperial project would ever face, the Parthian Empire eventually gave way, in 224 CE, to a new Persian dynasty that would prove even more consequential and would explicitly and self-consciously frame itself as a direct restoration of the ancient Achaemenid tradition, the Sasanian Empire. Founded by Ardashir I, after he overthrew the last Parthian king, Artabanus IV, in a rebellion launched from the Persian heartland of Fars, the very region, not coincidentally, where Cyrus the Great's original Achaemenid power base had been centered nearly 600 years earlier. The Sasanians made this connection to ancient Achaemenid glory an explicit and central part of their royal ideology, adopting grand royal titles, vigorously promoting a now fully systematized and codified Zoroastrian state religion, complete with an organized priesthood and the compilation of a comprehensive Zoroastrian religious canon, and undertaking monumental building and artistic projects that consciously echoed and sometimes directly referenced Achaemenid precedent. Sasanian Persia would go on to become Rome's, and later the Byzantine Empire's, single most persistent and dangerous rival for over 4 centuries, fighting repeated wars over control of Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Armenia, with the Sasanian king Shapur the first achieving what may be the single most humiliating military triumph any Persian state ever inflicted on Rome when he decisively defeated and captured the Roman Emperor Valerian in 260 CE. An almost unthinkable outcome that Sasanian propaganda celebrated for generations afterward in monumental rock relief carvings depicting Valerian in submission before the triumphant Persian king. This protracted and exhausting centuries-long struggle between Rome and successive Persian empires, first Parthian and then Sasanian, would continue right up until the early 7th century CE, when a final, catastrophically destructive war between the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius and the Sasanian king Khosrow II left both empires so militarily and economically exhausted that neither possessed the resources to effectively resist an entirely new and unexpected force erupting out of Arabia in the decades that followed. The armies of early Islam, whose conquests would, within a remarkably short period during the 7th century, bring the 4-century-old Sasanian Empire to its final end and fundamentally transform the religious and political landscape of the entire region, even as Persian administrative, cultural, and intellectual traditions would prove remarkably resilient, surviving this final political conquest in ways that would profoundly shape the new Islamic civilization rising in its place. The Arab conquest of Sasanian Persia in the 7th century represents, in the long view of history, far less of a clean break than it might initially appear, because, rather than being erased, Persian administrative practice, court culture, and intellectual tradition became deeply, foundationally woven into the new Islamic civilization that emerged across the conquered territories, to a degree that many people today, focused on the religious and political transformation, simply do not appreciate. The early Islamic caliphates, attempting to govern an empire that within a single generation had grown to encompass territories as administratively complex and diverse as anything the Achaemenids or Sasanians had ever managed, found themselves turning extensively to existing Persian bureaucratic models, and, quite literally, to Persian bureaucrats themselves, since the practical knowledge of how to run tax collection, postal and communication systems, and provincial administration across a vast multicultural empire did not simply vanish with the fall of the last Sasanian king, but persisted in the form of trained administrators, many of Persian origin, who transferred their expertise into service under the new Muslim rulers. The position of vizier, which would become one of the most important offices in Islamic governance for the next 1,000 years, across numerous dynasties and regions, has roots traceable to Persian administrative precedent, and the elaborate court ceremonial, the use of administrative titles, and even specific bureaucratic terminology in early Islamic governance show clear and well-documented Persian influence, particularly once the Abbasid Caliphate, beginning in the mid-8th century, shifted its capital to Baghdad in the heart of the old Persian and Mesopotamian cultural sphere and increasingly relied on Persian, specifically Khorasanian, administrative and military support as a crucial pillar of its power. Persian intellectual and scientific contributions during the subsequent Islamic Golden Age were similarly profound and extend across an extraordinary range of fields. Figures of Persian origin, or working within Persian cultural and linguistic spheres, made towering contributions to mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy during the medieval Islamic period, building directly on a long-standing Persian tradition of valuing and patronizing scholarly and scientific inquiry that stretched back, in attenuated form, to the kind of practical, astronomical, and administrative knowledge already evident in the Achaemenid period discussed earlier. The Persian language itself underwent a remarkable revival and flourishing in literary form during the centuries following the Arab conquest, producing some of the most celebrated poetry in all of world literature, including the works of poets whose names remain household terms across the Persian-speaking world and increasingly recognized internationally, writing in a new Persian language that, while now written in Arabic script and absorbing substantial Arabic vocabulary, remained recognizably continuous with the older Persian linguistic tradition stretching back through Middle Persian to the Old Persian of the Achaemenid royal inscriptions themselves, representing one of the most remarkable examples of linguistic and cultural continuity and resilience found anywhere in world history, a living thread connecting the language of Darius and Xerxes to the modern Persian, or Farsi, spoken by tens of millions of people across Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia today. Persian artistic traditions, particularly in textile design, ceramics, miniature painting, and above all in architecture, with its sophisticated use of geometric patterning, monumental domes, and decorative tile work, profoundly shaped the broader visual culture of the Islamic world, influencing artistic and architectural developments from the Indian subcontinent, where Persian-influenced Mughal architecture would eventually produce monuments like the Taj Mahal, to the Ottoman territories of Anatolia and the Balkans, demonstrating an artistic legacy whose geographic reach, ironically, came to rival or even exceed the territorial extent of the original Achaemenid Empire itself. And so we return, finally, to the question we began with. Why does an empire this consequential, this sophisticated, and this genuinely foundational to the development of large-scale governance, religious tolerance as state policy, and administrative innovation remain so persistently overshadowed in popular Western historical memory by Greece and Rome, civilizations that, for all their genuine and considerable achievements, governed smaller populations, controlled less territory for most of their respective histories, and in the Greek case specifically, never achieved anything resembling the kind of unified, multicultural, multilingual imperial governance that the Achaemenids had pioneered 2 centuries before Alexander supposedly liberated the Greek world from Persian tyranny? The answer, as we've explored throughout this journey, lies substantially in the accident of who controlled the historical narrative, Greek writers, and the Western intellectual tradition that inherited and built upon Greek and Roman cultural prestige simply got to tell the story first, and tell it most influentially, embedding a framework of Persian decadence and despotism into Western education and popular culture that took root so deeply that unwinding it has required more than a century of patient archaeological work, careful re-examination of the Persepolis fortification tablets and other primary administrative sources, and a willingness among modern historians to read Herodotus and his successors with appropriate critical distance rather than simply accepting their framing wholesale. The reality that emerges from this more careful reconstruction is a civilization that governed with a level of religious tolerance and administrative pragmatism remarkable for its era, that built communication and transportation infrastructure unmatched anywhere on Earth until the modern era, that established legal and bureaucratic norms still recognizable in administrative systems today, and that created a template for multicultural empire that subsequent great powers, Macedonian, Roman, Islamic, and beyond, would consciously or unconsciously draw upon for the next 2,000 years. The next time you use a postal system that relies on relay stations and standardized routes, the next time you encounter a government that taxes diverse regions according to differentiated economic capacity, rather than blunt uniform demands, the next time you witness a state that permits religious diversity among its population as a matter of practical policy rather than enforced uniformity, you are encountering, whether you realize it or not, echoes of an administrative philosophy first systematized on a grand scale by Cyrus, Darius, and their successors on the Iranian plateau 25 centuries ago. The Persian Empire did not lose history. It simply lost the right to tell its own story, and only now, slowly, through patient scholarship and a willingness to set aside 2,500 years of inherited bias, is that story finally being told with something approaching the accuracy and the respect it has always deserved.